floor is yours. Honorable members, after the question is answered, those who want to ask supplementaries go to intervention. But as usual, the screen is full. I don't know if it is full for this question or for other businesses. But we will find a way of going about it. Prime Cabinet Secretary, please take the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, let me just very quickly take this opportunity to thank the members of Parliament for according us an opportunity to be able to respond on matters of government policy to them in this august and esteemed House. Mr. Speaker, I'll go straight to dealing with the question at hand, and I would seek your indulgence, Mr. Speaker, to try and pick up this question in a matter that will help in the sequencing of the response. But I'll definitely deal with all the issues that have been raised by the Honourable Member. I shall accordingly, therefore, take up the issue number 2 of his question first. That is an explanation on the escalation of commodity prices. Mr. Speaker, the drivers or the causes of the escalation of prices of commodities were as follows. 1, inflation. Mr. Speaker, the overall inflation did not behave well. The Kenya National Bureau of Statistics indicate that in 2002, the inflation was around 7.9%, and it peaked in October 2022 to 9.6%, and in March it has declined slightly to 9.2% March this year. Inflation was pushed by the following factors: higher food prices resulting from reduced agricultural production and drought effects. Global supply chains were disrupted, mainly by the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Higher prices of imports were also pushed by the dollar effect and the supply constraints globally. And equally, Mr. Speaker, the higher global oil prices and elimination of subsidies for petrol and the substantive reduction of diesel and kerosene on account of unsustainability of the cost of maintaining the subsidy program. All these, Mr. Speaker, were a major cause of the changing prices of fuel and other commodities. The second item that caused an escalation of these foods, Mr. Speaker, is physical distress. Mr. Speaker, in a layman's language, the message I'm putting across here is that our public finances are not in good order. And it is a fact that we can no longer deny. The overall fiscal deficit, Mr. Speaker, including grants for the period of March, was 369.3 billion, which is 2.5% of GDP, against a target of 579 billion, which is 4% of GDP. This deficit was financed in 2 components: externally, 80.1 billion, and the net domestic financing at 287 billion. The gap, Mr. Speaker, is a total 43.8 billion, roughly 44 billion shillings. And this was attributed also to liquidity challenges in the domestic debt market. In other words, we had a revenue shortfall, therefore, of 133.2 billion Kenya shillings, and below target absorption of expenditures amounting to 332.6 billion. Mr. Speaker, fiscal stress was also reflected in the pressure of the public debt. Public debt consumes a substantial portion of our budget. In fact, members may wish to note that interest cost is now the single largest expenditure item in our recurrent budget, exceeding the wage bill and county equitable share. That is interest payments alone. Our total debt, Mr. Speaker, and this is very critical because we want to lay the facts bare to the nation, our total debt is 9.4 trillion against a debt ceiling of 10 trillion. This comprises external debt of 4.8 trillion and domestic debt of 4.5 trillion as at the end of March 2023. The cumulative debt service to external creditors as at the end of March stood at 312.6 billion, and this comprises a principal of 197 billion and interest payment of 115.7 billion. Mr. Speaker, the total outstanding national government pending bills as at 31st December 2022, now I'm talking about pending bills, amounted to 481 billion compared to 467.7 billion as at the end of 31st December 2021. This comprises 400.7 billion, that is 83%. 83% of this is from state corporations alone, and 80.3 billion is from ministries, departments, and agencies. Mr. Speaker, another factor that fueled the problem is the exchange rates. Mr. Speaker, since the pandemic, the exchange rate has helped absorb external shocks and preserve our competitiveness. However, the Kenya shilling has since depreciated against major international and regional currencies. It's exchanged at an average of 134 per US dollar, 134 Kenya shillings per US dollar in the month of April 2023, compared to 117.29 in June 2022. The volatility in the global financial markets has surged amid significant strengthening of the US dollar against major currencies and rapid changes in policy stance in advanced economies in response to inflationary pressures. Mr. Speaker, in addition to the domestic forex demands, they went up on a higher global prices for imported products, mainly food, fuel, and fertilizers. These are now much more expensive. Mr. Speaker, let me also point out that the official foreign exchange reserves have declined from 7,969.5 million. That is 4.4 months of import cover. As of December 2022, the 4 months of import cover as at February 2023, the usable forex reserves declined to 7.1, but the usable forex reserves remained adequate at 6,531 million US dollars. That is 3.63 months of import cover as at 19th April 2023. This, honorable members, still meets the Central Bank of Kenya statutory requirements to endeavor to maintain at least 4 months of import cover. Mr. Speaker, together these developments have significantly impacted liquidity in the domestic forex market. In particular, the interbank forex transactions have declined, limiting price action in that market. The exchange rate, honorable members, impacts directly on the cost of living in Kenya as imported goods and services have become more expensive. Mr. Speaker, let me also touch on particular causes of the escalation of food prices from 2022 and 2023. Mr. Speaker, the country has experienced a prolonged period of drought over the last 2.5 years. From the year 2020 to 2023, which has been recorded as the worst drought in 40 years. The performance of the 2022 long rains was poor in parts of the country, which was followed by crop failure in the Asals during the short rain season. The anticipated relief from the October, November, December 2022 short rains season was not realized, except for pulses due to the prolonged drought that resulted in a 6th failed rain season. This scenario reduced the annual maize production, creating a higher national deficit of about 34% in 2022 compared to 28% in 2021. Mr. Speaker, I would like to let the House know that the country recorded the lowest maize production in 10 years. The lowest production of maize in 10 years. We managed to get, as a nation, 34.4 million bags, which is 3.1 million metric tons in 2022. Ordinarily, we would be talking about close to 50 million bags or 48 million bags, but we got 34. The country also lost approximately 2.5 million heads of livestock due to the drought effects. Mr. Speaker, it is therefore important to note that the onset of the current rain season and associated flash floods has also occasioned further loss of livestock of unknown value, and a planned rapid assessment will determine the actual cause. That means the government is planning to have a rapid assessment to determine the actual loss. Mr. Speaker, extreme climate change events, growing population, rising food prices, and other environmental stressors have emerged as key drivers of food insecurity and malnutrition. It is further acknowledged that the supply chain disruptions of 2020 to 2022 due to negative global events, that is COVID-19 pandemic and its lingering effects, the impact of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, and high fuel prices have increased the percentage of food insecure populations. Mr. Speaker, in my written statement, I've endeavored to share specific data on this particular question, but I'll not go through with that. Let me now pick up the issue of what is the government doing, or what measures has the government taken to cushion Kenyans from the high cost of living occasioned by these rising prices of basic commodities. Mr. Speaker, the first step is to focus on enhancing food security. The government aims to achieve food self-sufficiency and reduce imports through increased production and productivity of all staple food crops, including stepping up production of oilseed crops such as sunflower and sesame. The March, April, May 2023 rain season is predicted to be normal, and we thank God for that. We intend to maximize our production potential for the rain-dependent grain-producing areas. The first significant harvest of grain is expected to enter the market in August 2023. Mr. Speaker, we also have some short-term measures to address the food security situation. The government has taken the long-term, sustainable approach of resolving the cost of living predicament by subsidizing production instead of consumption. However, there are a number of immediate interventions that are aimed as short-term solutions to the high cost of living and at the same time build momentum for the long-term approach. Key to this, Mr. Speaker, is the fertilizer subsidy program. During the 2022-23 short rain season, the government availed 3.1 million bags of fertilizer worth Kenya shillings 3.5 billion to improve farmers' uptake and agricultural yields. In the current long rain season, the government has launched the enhanced e-voucher fertilizer subsidy program, through which it has availed 6 million 50 kilogram bags of subsidized fertilizer worth Kenya shillings 15 billion, retailing at a cost of Kenya shillings 3,500 per bag, down from the market price of 6,500 per bag, representing a subsidy of Kenya shillings 3,000 per bag for fertilizer. To date, Mr. Speaker, 2,246,000 e-vouchers have been issued to registered farmers. As at 22nd April 2023, 28 counties were participating in the maize and coffee value chains. The total digitally registered farmers in these counties was 2,332,000 farmers. In these counties, 1,960,000 50 kilogram bags of fertilizers have been bought, and by a total of 271,684 farmers. Subsidized fertilizer for tea and coffee farmers has also been organized under the same program. And Mr. Speaker, again, I'll table some data or statistics on how this fertilizer has been distributed across the counties. Mr. Speaker, another intervention from the government is the provision of duty waivers on food imports. To bridge the food stocks deficit and stabilize the high food commodity prices, the government has granted duty waiver for importation of 1.4 million metric tons of white maize, 600,000 metric tons of rice, 500,000 metric tons of yellow maize, largely to be used for production of animal feed, 200,000 metric tons of soya beans, 300 metric tons of soybean meal, 1,600 metric tons of assorted protein concentrate, and 40,000 metric tons of feed additives, effective from 1st February to 6th of August 2023. Mr. Speaker, you will note that this program is being put in place to end before the Kenyan farmers' harvest season begins. Mr. Speaker, the duty-free maize imports will temporarily reduce the high cost of maize and flour for consumer benefits in the short term. However, the cost of food will be dictated by supply and demand, which is the key focus of the Kenya Kwanza government. Mr. Speaker, we will also engage in active post-harvest management programs, because it is estimated that Kenyan farmers lose about 30% of their crops. So we will put more effort in this particular area. We will also support the farmers in ensuring that we also deal with enhanced pest control and aflatoxin efforts to eliminate the danger of our foods being contaminated. We also intend to promote drought-tolerant crops. Mr. Speaker, in the current year, over 250 metric tons of assorted drought-tolerant seeds valued at Kenya shillings 50 million have been distributed in Embu, Meru, Makueni, Machakos, Tharaka Nithi, Murang'a, Nyeri, Siaya, and Busia counties. These being basic seeds, it is expected that farmers will multiply and redistribute the seeds in their localities, thus addressing the challenge of seed access and food insecurity. Mr. Speaker, we also have quite a number of other government programs in collaboration with the county governments. These are programs that support crop and livestock insurance, the National Value Chain Support Program, small-scale irrigation programs, value addition programs, Kenya Cereals Enhancement Programs, Kenya Climate Smart Support Programs, just to name a few that are designed to help the farmers. Mr. Speaker, now let me come to the aspect of reducing the cost of fuel. The government has done the following. First, the government has lifted the moratorium on power purchase agreements as a way of enhancing the country's energy security by opening up the energy sector to continued investments and leveraging on the market forces of demand and supply. However, the price benefits will not be immediate due to other exogenous factors. Secondly, Mr. Speaker, prior to April 2023, the government imported all its petroleum product requirements through the open tendering system. The monthly requirement, and I think this is very useful for the members, the monthly requirement is approximately 740,000 metric tons of fuel. That is monthly. And this translates to, in monetary terms, it translates to about $70 million per month. All these petroleum products imports were paid for in US dollars, which put a strain on the government's forex reserves and caused a huge deficiency in availability of US dollars, causing depreciation of the Kenya shilling. The US dollar requirements by oil marketing companies account for about 30% of Kenya's total US dollar requirements. And I want to repeat that. The US dollar requirements by oil marketing companies accounts for about 30% of Kenya's total US dollar requirements, putting local foreign exchange reserves under pressure. In an effort to ease the aforementioned pressure, the government therefore entered into a memorandum of understanding with prospective governments and master framework agreements with their respective petroleum trading entities for the supply of petroleum products for a term of 270 days on extended credit for a period of 180 days. This arrangement is referred to as the government-to-government arrangement, G2G arrangement. Under the foregoing terms, Mr. Speaker, the G2G arrangement is under implementation, and the first cargoes, I'm emphasizing this, the first cargoes, that is MT Front Capella, delivering 80,000 metric tons of Jet A1 fuel, and MT Nord Dolphin, delivering 85,000 metric tons of petrol, were received at the port of Mombasa, respectively on Thursday, 13th of April, 2023. Other cargoes have been scheduled and are expected in the country. The first consignment having been received, the positive effects of this arrangement should start being felt in the near term. This intervention is also expected to reduce pressure on our foreign exchange and lower the cost of petroleum. Mr. Speaker, let me also focus on reducing the cost of cooking gas. Mr. Speaker, the government, or let me put it this way, we have moved swiftly to end the monopoly in the sourcing and supply of cooking gas, which inevitably had resulted in price inflation. The government has opened up this sector by reviewing the policy to allow for competition by setting stage for additional players to be licensed to set up liquefied petroleum gas, that is LPG facilities. This will cut the cost of handling and evacuating gas from the ships to the mainland, hence allowing the dealers to transfer the cost reliefs to the consumer. Mr. Speaker, now let me touch on how we are addressing the depreciation of the Kenya shilling against other currencies. Government is implementing sound exchange rate policies to stabilize the local currency and manage the foreign exchange reserves in an effort to mitigate the impact of currency fluctuations. As I noted earlier in my statement, in response to the question, the official foreign exchange reserves have declined from 7.9 million US dollars, which is equivalent to 4.4 months of import cover, as at December 2022, to 7.1 million US dollars, which is equivalent to 4 months of import cover, as at February this year. The usable foreign exchange reserves have remained adequate at 6,531 million US dollars, that is 3.6 months of import cover as at April 19th. This, Mr. Speaker, meets the Central Bank of Kenya statutory requirement to endeavor to maintain at least 4 months of import cover. The G2G arrangement for the importation of petroleum products that accounts for up to 30% of Kenya's USD requirements is expected to not only stabilize the exchange rate, but also to lead to the appreciation of the Kenya shilling. Mr. Speaker, let me now highlight some of the immediate steps that the government is taking to stabilize the economy and set the country on a growth trajectory. These are several, but I'll just try and pick out a few. Mr. Speaker, as the House will appreciate, the measures to cushion Kenyans from the high cost of living, as well as reduce the cost of basic commodities, as I have enumerated above, will invariably also result in a stabilized economy. I will therefore take this opportunity to highlight other measures aimed at stabilizing the economy. First, the government remains committed to programs jointly formulated with its development partners, through which we anticipate to get much needed budget support. And I believe when the Cabinet Secretary for Treasury will be speaking to Parliament in a few weeks' time, he will elaborate on this. We will continue bolstering economic resilience by pursuing prudent macroeconomic policies geared at reducing debt vulnerabilities and supporting sustainable and inclusive development. Mr. Speaker, through the Fiscal Consolidation Program, we aim to continue with our revenue mobilization and expenditure prioritization policies geared towards economic recovery. This will support sustained, rapid, and inclusive economic growth and safeguard livelihoods, thus creating a physical space for the implementation of government priority programs. With inflation remaining above the target band, our monetary policy will remain focused on maintaining price stability by resisting the pass-through of second-round effects from higher food and fuel prices to other prices and keeping inflationary pressures well anchored. Over the medium term, inflation is expected to return to the midpoint of 5% of our target band. Our target band is 2.5 to 7.5%. The central bank, on its part, has proactively tightened its monetary policy stance to prevent second-round effects and keep inflation expectations anchored. The CBK rate was raised to 9.5% in March 2023. This is expected to gradually reduce inflation in the coming months. The exchange rate flexibility has worked as a shock absorber in the face of a variety of external shocks and will continue to do so to help support our competitiveness, protect reserves, and facilitate efficient functioning of our domestic foreign exchange market. Mr. Speaker, these policies are mutually reinforcing in support of maintaining macroeconomic stability and resilience, ensuring fiscal and debt sustainability, and enhancing buffers against external shocks. The government will implement the bottom-up economic transformation agenda that is geared towards economic turnaround and inclusive growth as specified in the budget policy statement, which I'm happy to note this House has already approved. Finally, it is important to take cognizance of the functioning of markets, especially on the supply side, where there are threats to market like political unrest, strikes, and maandamano. The functionality of the markets is impaired, thus slowing down economic recovery. Mr. Speaker, I pause there so that I can take up some supplementary questions.
Thank you, Prime Cabinet Secretary. Before I call on Yusuf to fire his first supplementary, allow me, honorable members, to acknowledge in the Speaker's Gallery, Mandera County Assembly officers of the Assembly from Mandera East. You may stand to be acknowledged. Thank you. On my behalf and on behalf of Parliament as a whole, we welcome you. In the public gallery, I acknowledge the presence of the following institutions: Africa Youth Leadership Forum from Dagoretti North, Nairobi, Pendo Youth Group from Konoin in Bomet, Kwanjenga Primary School from Embakasi South, Nairobi, and the Goshen Academy from Kuria West in Migori. Again, on my behalf and your behalf, honorable members, we welcome the four institutions to the House of Parliament. Honorable Hassan, you may ask your supplementary question.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like on the onset to say that while the Prime Cabinet Secretary has outlined the long-term measures that the government is hoping to benefit from and jumpstart our economy, I have not really had adequate steps that the government would take to address the cost of living in the short term and in the medium term. It is good to provide fertilizers to our farmers, but 30% of our population live in urban centers where they are suffering from the high cost of living. And apart from the wish list that perhaps with the bumper harvest, with the stabilization of the global economy, it appears as if the government is entirely leaving the Kenyan public to the vulgars of the economy and supply and demand issues. The second point I also wanted to speak about is, since the Prime Cabinet Minister has highlighted the runaway debt crisis in the country, our escalating national debt is like an albatross, which if not handled with care and seriousness, the seriousness it demands, could choke the life out of our national economy and undermine our national development. I already hear from economists that in fact our national debt is already above the 10 trillion. So what concrete action is the government doing or taking to ensure that in fact our debt does not escalate beyond a situation where we are no longer able to service it? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Honorable Yusuf. Cabinet Secretary, you will take several,
Okay.
and then you can answer them together. Geoffrey Ruku. I hope you've keyed in for this.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Had you intervened for asking a supplementary? Or it was for something totally different?
It's totally different.
Yes. Okay. That's the problem I have with this screen. Major Dong.
Major Dong is there.
Is there? Give him the...
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to ask Prime Cabinet Secretary a supplementary question. Could the Prime Cabinet Secretary confirm whether the subsidy fertilizer that the government supplied is going to be a continuous process? Yes, whether it is going to be a continuous process and for how long? The second one, on the same, could the Prime Cabinet Secretary indicate whether the budgetary allocation on the same for the subsidy fertilizer will be included in the national budget estimates expected this week in this parliament? Thank you.
Mawade of Embakasi South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To the Prime Cabinet Secretary, just wanted to ask, you've given a very long feedback or answer on Honorable Yusuf's very specific question. The local or the common mwananchi wants to know when the cost of commodities, and especially the consumables like unga and the cooking oil, will be lowered. That way they become affordable, especially for people like from Mukuru, Kwanjenga, Kwaruben, and the lower income sections. Thank you.
Majority Leader.
Thank you, Honorable Speaker. Honorable Speaker, from what I've heard from the Prime Cabinet Secretary, there are a number of measures that government has already taken, and I appreciate the fact of what he has said on the production of maize, that we have the lowest production of maize in the last 10 years. And he has stipulated various measures, including the subsidy to, production subsidy in fertilizer subsidy rather than consumption subsidy. So my question is, one, whether government is considering, because we have had calls for reintroduction of the consumer subsidies in maize, whether government is considering any consumption subsidies, especially the maize subsidy that was there before the election. And two, I have also seen farmers in the North Rift raise issues on whether they were getting subsidized fertilizer for top dressing fertilizer. I want to hear from the Cabinet Secretary whether government is indeed considering to give farmers the top dressing subsidized fertilizer.
Member for cases.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And I want, first of all, to appreciate Leader Majority for bringing out a serious issue in the entire North Rift. Transport, Mr. Speaker, forms a key driver in matters of economic transformation. We are experiencing a serious challenges along the northern corridor, especially within Keses region. Several non-tariff barriers have been mounted by police, starting from Timboroa. We have one at Napkoi Junction. We have one at Kondo, Banforest Tarakwa polling station. We have one in Bayete Center. The worst is in Jeptiret police station at the junction. We have one in another one around Eldoret Junction to the whole Nairobi Road. I want to know why all these non-tariff barriers. This is a corridor that enables transport crisscrossing the landlocked countries and even interfering with the transport around the region, especially this is a agricultural center. With tariffs, toll stations that are not registered, we don't know the collection being done by the same officers where it is going. I want to know what are the plans by the government to ensure we his transport and support business and support communication between the countries around the EAC. Thank you.
Thank you. A member for Daoud, is that you? Daoud from Wajir.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Prime Cabinet Secretary. My question is that I've heard a lot of things that the Prime Cabinet Secretary has said regarding production subsidy. Mr. Prime Cabinet Secretary, what plans do you have for production subsidy for the livestock sector? I've heard of fertilizer, tea, coffee. Are we still going back to the sessional paper number 10 of 1965 and forgetting the rest of Kenya? Secondly,
only one.
Thank you.
You are done. Kamket, since you are chairing, it means your question is asked. Pukose.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank the Prime Cabinet. My question is, you've given the measures about what the government is planning. When do we expect the economy to improve?
Thank you. Prime, those are 6. I'll take 2 more. Rindikiri.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Could the Prime Cabinet Secretary tell us why the government has not considered supplying seeds to the farmers together with fertilizer? Mr. Speaker, I think that's very important. You supply the fertilizer, but you don't supply the seeds, knowing that the farmers have gone for a long time without lanes, and therefore they didn't have the seeds that they can use for fertilizer. Thank you.
Women Rep Kwale. Is that Mombasa or Kwale? Mombasa. You know you look alike with your colleague from Kwale.
Asante sana Bwana Spika. Swali langu laenda kwa Waziri Mkuu. Napenda kujua kule Dongo Kundu Special Economic Zone. Mmetumia mbinu gani kufidia wale waliopokonywa mashamba yao pale ili kufanya huo mradi? Kwa sababu kuna tetesi kuwa kuna yule ambaye pengine alikuwa na ekari 7 ama 10 amepewa only 50 by 100. Natamani sana kujua. Asante sana.
Last on this round, Irene Mayaka. Members, be patient. I'll give you enough time to ask questions. So there will be another round.
Thank you, Honorable Speaker. Speaker, I'd like to ask a follow-up question on what the Cabinet Secretary had talked about, the war in Ukraine being one of the issues that are causing our economic issues. And my question is particularly on the import of wheat, because wheat is one of the things that we import most from Ukraine. And seeing that there's still no solution to the conflict, what are the auxiliary measures that the government is putting in place to make sure that they cushion Mwananchi? Because as we all know, wheat is one of those products that we get a lot of foodstuff from. Thank you.
Thank you. Prime Cabinet Secretary, those are 9 supplementaries. You may answer.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Speaker.
We'll come back to you.
Yes, yes. I'll respond not necessarily in any specific order, but to try and pick on them. First of all, I just want to mention that some of the immediate steps to try and deal with the crisis is that the government has already waived duty on some of the food products that are coming in during this period that we are going through a crisis. Mr. Speaker, the records we have is that in this process of waiver, the government has waived close to the equivalent of 10 billion Kenya shillings worth of food coming in. What is critical is that we have a record, although I may not have it with me at this point in time, but we have a record of the people who have imported. And my message to them is that we look forward for them to immediately pass the benefit of that duty waiver to the consumers, to the citizens. If they do not, then it will mean that some other steps would have to be taken. So I want to make it very clear to all those who have been part of the program where duty waiver has been granted to make sure that they do not delay in passing over that benefit to the ordinary Mwananchi. Mr. Speaker, the issue of the debt crisis, very soon, and I think there's a bill that is either before the House or it's about to come, where we want to adjust the law so that we can move away from a debt ceiling and to start talking about the anchor, debt anchor. So, Mr. Speaker, I would want to hold my horses here in the sense that during the debate of this particular aspect, the Treasury Cabinet Secretary will speak more to the programs and the approach we want to have on this debt menace that we are facing. But some of the things that we have outlined, which are not new because some of us have spoken to it before, is that we will have to continue working on the fiscal consolidation, looking at an enhanced revenue collection measures so that we are less dependent on external funding. Secondly, we are making it very clear that it is our intention to focus more on concessional borrowing, where we're borrowing externally, and shy away to the extent possible from commercial borrowing. This is particularly critical as we move along. The other thing, Mr. Speaker, is that we have to cut back and focus on what are the real priorities. And you will recall that in the very early days of the President Ruto's government's taking up office, he did make a pronouncement that he was cutting back about 300 billion Kenya shillings of expenditure programs that were not regarded as priority expenditure. So this program of both fiscal consolidation, those that require enhanced revenue collection, and also refocusing on our priorities will continue for as long as it takes. Mr. Speaker, I want to confirm that the subsidy on fertilizers will have to be with us a little longer. And indeed, I want to confirm that this has been factored into the 2023-2024 budget so that we can continue to focus on production and productivity. Mr. Speaker, consumption subsidies. This is where I would like us to say that we cannot, in all sincerity, sustain consumption subsidies. As a nation, we have to be honest to ourselves. And one of the areas that I can give you as an example is that when there was the subsidy on fuel, it was costing the government of Kenya, which includes yourselves as taxpayers, about 16 to 20 billion shillings per month. 16 to 20 billion shillings per month on a subsidy on fuel that was impossible to sustain. So no matter who would be in the driving seat of government, it is not practical to sustain that kind of subsidy. However, even as the government removed the subsidy on petrol, Mr. Speaker, we were alive to the fact that diesel, which is used in public transport, used by the farmers and other critical areas, there we have maintained some measure of subsidy, and also on kerosene, because these are the ones that affect the ordinary man more than anything else. Mr. Speaker, the fertilizer, when we talk of fertilizer, it is not just the planting fertilizer, but it also includes fertilizer that is the top dressing fertilizers that may be required in other areas. I also want to assure, I think, the member of Wajir that in my statement, I did mention that there are also livestock programs to support the farmers, livestock or pastoralists who have lost, and I gave a figure of about 2.5 million livestock, heads of cattle, goats, sheep combined. They have lost a lot of money through the livestock during the drought period. And with our development partners, there are efforts to support them in restocking and also to support the offtake as we go forward. So it is absolutely critical that the efforts that come into this sector are holistic and not directed at any to the isolation or at the expense of the livestock farmer. Now, let me see if I can pick up something else. Mr. Speaker, there's the question of what kind of time it will take to recover. I want to be very honest to this House and to the Kenyan people, and having had an opportunity to have served as a Minister for Finance before, in a moment of crisis, I want to state to the Kenyan people that we are in this for a long haul. The circumstances that we are in cannot be wished away like instant coffee. And I've said this quite a number of times. We are going to have focus on priorities and have them sustained consistently, religiously, and from a personal perspective, we need to be prepared to have about 2 years of challenges as Kenyans. But there is hope, because it is in that process of sustained good policies consistently being put in place, and we looking at them and working from a unified viewpoint as Kenyans, we shall be able to turn around the economy. Remember, I have highlighted the huge public debt. I have highlighted the exogenous factors like the Ukraine war. We have, for instance, no capacity to determine when the Russia-Ukraine war will come to an end. It's beyond us. It will take a lot of international effort and the goodwill of the combatants to be able to deal with that. So we have to be realistic as leaders to the people who give us an opportunity to serve them, that it will take a bit of time. And Mr. Speaker, I want to say that no situation is permanent. No situation is permanent. Even the challenging times that we are going through now shall be overcome. They shall be overcome. And I want us to believe in that. Mr. Speaker, there are some questions that have been raised about the non-tariff barriers. I may not have an immediate answer, but I think it's a very valid point raised. And I think I will take this up with our colleagues, my colleagues in transport, so that we can have a holistic response to this at a later date. But it is true that the non-tariff barriers are not just an obstacle to international trade, but especially when they are in the arteries, but also an obstacle to our own trade in the country. I don't know whether there is anything else.
Cabinet Secretary, there was a question from one member on why you are not giving simultaneously the subsidy on planting fertilizer and top dressing fertilizer.
Yes, and seeds.
Yes.
Mr. Speaker, I think I will take this up with
As you take that also, there's an unrelated question from the Women Rep Mombasa about Dongokundu compensations.
Yes, I was going to come to that. Can I make a commitment that we will relay this particular concern to the Ministry of Lands so that we can get a very accurate position on this particular aspect of compensation in Dongokundu. Mr. Speaker, I do agree that when we talk of production, we need to support the farmer, not just with the fertilizer, but on the fertilizer I've said there is both the planting fertilizer and there shall be top dressing fertilizer. On the issue of the seeds, this is again a vital point, and I think I can only commit that in the package to the farmers, the government will also enhance support on seed. I did mention in my statement that we did provide some seed for those that are in the drought-stricken areas. There was support of about 50 million in terms of seedlings that the government has already given out. So we will also see how that particular area can be enhanced. Good.
Another round. Member for Kipkelion West, Hillary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the Cabinet Secretary, Prime Cabinet Secretary for a long response. But he has alluded that the public debt consumes a substantial portion of our budget, and that the interest cost is the single largest expenditure item in our recurrent budget, exceeding the wage bill and county equitable share of revenue. I want to ask if there are any attempts by this government to negotiate for the restructuring of these huge and expensive debts to give the economy some breathing space as we do other measures to revive locally. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
James Nyikal.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. While appreciating the measures that the government has taken, I would like to ask the Prime Minister questions on energy. Energy is probably one of the biggest drivers of costs of living. With power, I didn't get any information on how the government is intending to deal with independent power producers whose contracts, we are all aware, has caused very serious impact on the cost of power. And fuel distribution also is a problem, because what EPRA has done before, the fuel prices has only been the big importers and their pump price, leaving nothing for the resellers in the middle without any profit margin, and many have been driven out of business, leaving just the big importers who are also selling, and most of them are foreign, creating a situation of a cartel behavior in the fuel industry. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. A member for, I can't see clearly, the honorable member right in front of me. Who? Roku, you said you had no question. Now, Martin Wanyonyi, you might decide whether you want to ask a question or not. Martin Wanyonyi.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question to the Prime Cabinet Secretary: can the Prime Cabinet Secretary tell the country on how much deficit of maize is the country having, and how much maize are they planning to import? And finally, Mr. Speaker, what plans is the government having to ensure that the maize that we are planning to harvest in the next 3 months is not affected, their prices is not affected by this imported maize in the country? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Makali Mulu.
Yeah, thank you, Honorable Speaker. Honorable Speaker, I really want to appreciate this presentation from the Prime Cabinet Secretary. It gives very good proposals on how to move this economy forward. Of interest are two issues. One is how to address the food deficit, the issue of the fertilizer. Honorable Speaker, we realize that this fertilizer is being given to all the farmers who register in whichever regions have been identified. The question I would want to ask the Prime Cabinet Secretary is, has anybody thought about improving the efficiency or optimization of the results by doing proper targeting, so that rather than giving general subsidy to every farmer, you target the farmers to benefit for purposes of optimizing the results? The other important issue is the issue of government-to-government issue, Honorable Speaker, the issue of government-to-government arrangement. Honorable Speaker, this is a very good and a creative idea, but this idea normally serves as issues of accountability and oversight. I would want to hear what measures are in place to ensure that even as we engage on this important strategy, we are assured of accountability and oversight by key institutions like Parliament. Thank you, Honorable Speaker.
Professor Barto.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate the fact that farmers were given subsidized fertilizer during the planting season, but my question is, the Prime Minister has rightly said they support the farmer all through from the planting season all the way. But unfortunately, the top tracing fertilizer currently is selling at 3,500, which is very high compared to previously when it was below 2,000. Are there plans to bring down that top tracing fertilizer to affordable price to the farmers? Because this is the time they are supposed to be top tracing, and it is very crucial, but unfortunately, the fertilizer is very expensive.
Thank you. Bensouda, what is out of order? Kamket? What is out of order, Kamket?
Mr. Speaker, I don't know whether you've heard, Mr. Speaker, the Honorable Lady refer to the Prime Cabinet Secretary as Prime Minister. And even Professor Nyikal indeed refer to the Prime Cabinet Secretary as Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, do we have the Prime Cabinet Secretary here, or do we have a Prime Minister?
Kamket, I would rather you get preoccupied with substance than form. Bensouda. Give Bensouda the mic.
Thank you so much, Mr. Speaker, for giving me this opportunity. And I think we are discussing very fundamental issues. I want to appreciate what has been presented, but Mr. Speaker, I also want to say or state categorically that the presentation appears too theoretical. I'm not seeing how it is going, the presentation, how it is going to practically address the Kenyan issues in the short term. Long term, we can wait to see and hope, as has been put. But remember, Kenyans are suffering. So my first question is...
Only one, so you don't have a first.
Okay, but you allow the commas in between because they are subsequent of my question, Mr. Speaker. Yes. I want to ask on the demystification of the monetary policy, because the Kenyans are watching us, asking questions, getting responses, clarifications. So could we have clear demystification of the monetary policy in practically addressing the economic situation and also ensuring that what mitigation approaches or strategies do we really have that are going to pull down the economic situation and ensure that food and fuel and any other subsidy is brought practically? Because what I've been presented for is not really convincing. We are still living in the future, Mr. Speaker, and yet if you would have at least a strategy that will cushion in the short term, that we agree to elevate in the midterm, and so be told what is it that is left for the long term. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Major Asso.
Thank you very much, Honorable Speaker. PCS, when you outlined your response, you say one of the problems is dollar supply. In a recent committee visit to the US, our engagement with the diaspora, it came out that many Kenyans out there, they want to invest in this economy. And one of their investment is to put dollars into this economy. What is it that the government is doing to approach those Kenyans and without any much bureaucracy that will be able to have enough dollar supply from Kenyans out there? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Kakai Bissau.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for giving me this opportunity. For the Prime Cabinet Secretary, thank you also for the quick overview and honest feedback to this House. But my question is, you talked about 2 years. We have to really fasten our belts, waiting for the hard times. But my question is, you mentioned about the ship having docked on the 13th of April. Now my question is, yes, G2G is a good initiative, but based on the LTAs, the master long-term agreements that have been signed, will you be specific on what is our expectation in the short term in terms of the liter of petrol, liter of diesel, and most importantly, kerosene, based on the ships that have docked. Because I'm sure there was some simulation, some numbers were cracked, and I'm sure there's something you've worked out to ensure that we have specific in terms of cost. And finally, from the maize production area, with a target of 50 million bags, but we ended up with about 34 million bags. I would like you to reassure this House that for the recently received fertilizer, it's been tested and is going to ensure that it's a bumper harvest. Because I know in most cases we are talking about the weather, the rains, but I would also like you to reassure us that the fertilizer that we've received is actually going to ensure we have a bumper harvest. Thank you.
The last on that batch, Mwengi Mutuse.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Briefly, I wanted to find out from the Cabinet Secretary, from the Prime Cabinet Secretary, whether indeed there are plans by the government to contract farmers in Zambia to plant maize on our behalf, and if there are those plans, why the same cannot be done with the lands that are idle under ADC, Kenya prisons, and also with local farmers. I thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Prime Cabinet Secretary, you can answer those 10.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Let me pick up a little bit on the issue of energy, because a number of members have raised concerns on the cost of energy. Mr. Speaker, in my statement I did say that one of the things that we are pushing is to open up the energy sector for more players to come in, so that we move away from having a club of a few players in this particular sector. And I gave the example, for instance, of the LPG gas, so that we have more players coming in. Mr. Speaker, I know that the government also set up a committee to look into the various IPPG agreements so that they can be rationalized in accordance with the terms of those agreements. And I think the Ministry of Energy should be making some specific reports on this area in due course. Mr. Speaker, we would want to encourage all, even the big traders working alongside the small traders in this sector. So we are going to be strong on encouraging market free and competitive processes in this sector, save for a situation where we are going through this crisis. Now, Mr. Speaker, when we talk of energy, we also talk of electricity. And I have highlighted two key factors. One is that the exchange rate has taken a beating, the Kenya shilling has taken a beating, and this feeds in the cost of fuel, even in the cost of diesel, and ultimately, even in the cost of electricity. So these are factors that we have to take into account. Mr. Speaker, it is important to also know that we are diversifying as a nation. We are encouraging more and more investment in the geothermal sector, as an example, so that we stop relying on just the rains, and at the same time we rely less, that is hydro, we rely less sometimes on hydro because it takes very long to develop hydro, but we are increasing our capacity and our potential in energy through a lot of investment in the geothermal area, in the solar area, in the wind area, and we hope that somewhere along not too distant future, all these investments will come to bear and help us reduce the cost of doing business in this country, including the cost of electricity, which is also critical in production in many areas. Mr. Speaker, I think I want to assure the members that the import program is being monitored so that it does not undermine the local farmers. This is something we are watching very, very closely so that the projections that come from Ministry of Agriculture indicate to us that if we are true to the program that we have on imports and make sure that it ends before August, then when the harvest season sets in, the local farmer will not suffer. So this is something that we are monitoring very closely through the Ministry of Agriculture. Mr. Speaker, if I may just highlight that when we look at the imports of maize as an example, and I'll also release this because it's on the table in the written statement I've given, that you will notice that in 2023, we may have about 2.4 million bags of maize coming in as an example, and about 3.6 on wheat, and rice we could have about 4.8 million. All these cumulatively will come to about 10.9 or 11 million bags of cereals that are coming in around the staples. We also project to import this year close to maybe 240 million bags of beans as well. Mr. Speaker, this is a cycle, and it's so important that when we engage in the import program, you are looking at timely delivery of whatever is required, and it should not coincide